Hello, everyone. Welcome yet again to another episode of the INANDA Podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about Youth Day, and with me today is Katlego Mokgosi. How are you, Kat?
What's up, bro? I'm good. How are you?
Great, thank you. So, I have you here today to tell us about Youth Day. What does that mean to you, Kat?
To be honest, I think it means to me what it means to many people our age, right? Nothing, to be honest, right? Like it has meaning, but I think over time it's lost its meaning because we aren't necessarily exposed to the same struggles, especially in an environment like this. So for me, I think it means commemoration, but in terms of like personal relatability, it's not something that I relate to heavily at the moment right now. Yeah.
And do you have any idea why it's something that's slowly fizzling out in today's society with more of the youth?
I think it is probably to do with the way we educate. Education systems are premised on just teaching you what happened. So the events of the day are not necessarily what it means to people. Even when you get taught, we never actually get like an extract of perhaps like 5 people who were there on the day, you know what I mean? So you can never connect the history to the people that were involved in the making of that history. And so it seems very abstract. I think B, we are also advancing. So upward social mobility of Black people is becoming higher. And so our proximity to the struggle is becoming lower. And what that means then is that we are slightly disconnected from culture. And these are the kinds of things that influence culture, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it is a combination of us moving up and moving further away from townships, moving further away from where the struggle originally was, to perhaps a more corporate type of struggle and stuff like that. Yeah.
So, at any point in history or your time at the school, was there anything that made you aware of what Youth Day means to you as an individual?
I think, yeah, but I don't know that it would be things at the school, right? I think it's still the fact that I have family, go Soweto, and I visit them often. The fact that my parents weren't necessarily there on the day, but they are at the very least more in tune with the history itself. So they made an effort to take me to the museum in Soweto that commemorates a lot of the apartheid key moments and stuff like that. And then I think also the friends I chose to associate with, right? Like I think a lot of my friends, especially Divine, was very switched on when it came to Black people, Black struggle, liberation. But also then being in an environment where as much as there are Black boys in the school, it's not necessarily a home for Black boys as yet, right? So trying to maneuver and make changes that allow for the Inanda space to also be a home for Black people, which isn't a fault of its own necessarily. It's just the systems itself. So being exposed to pseudo like separation and stuff like that is interesting and kind of prompts that line of thinking.
So, one of the things I noticed about the way history is taught to us is that it's more textbook words on a page. Would you say it's not as interactive as it should be for people to understand the importance of it?
Yeah, I think it isn't as interactive as it should be. And at the point where they try to be interactive, it's not that great. So it's like a museum trip when you're in grade 4, maybe another one when you're in grade 8. And then it's chai from there, right? Because you're behind in math, so you can't be doing too much there by history. But overall, I think that it isn't taught to the extent that it should be. Yeah.
I hear you. And is there anything, or can you think of a life experience that made you think of Youth Day differently as to what you used to think of it previously before that event? Is there any event?
I don't know. I don't know that I have, right? But I've seen events where I see youth come together and like do things that are immaculate, right? Like I think entering the creative space after high school exposed me to a lot of creatives, like the team that's here today. Majority of them are just in the creative space and they're pushing things that are crazy, right? Like our videographer, photographer has a billboard on Rivonia Road in Grayson Drive. So he's pushing, right? Our producers are on YFM and they're pushing, right? So seeing the unity that the youth has today to make something for themselves has been dope for me, right? Like something that is different to the norm and the go be a doctor, go be this. Yeah. So it's been dope. Yeah.
That's great. Now, Youth Day for a lot of much younger children is something that's just seen as a holiday. Have you thought of anything that could help us change the narrative of Youth Day?
Not really, hey. Like, I think one thing I realized about uni is that a high school environment is very sheltered and you're like in an egg and you're nestled and you're taken care of. In the real world, it is huge. Like, this is probably like a drop in the ocean, a speck even. And so when we go out into the real world, you get to see that like there's so much to change that you can't want to change everything.
Yeah.
You need to focus on what you can do and use your platform to push. So an example would be something like this. You guys starting a podcast to discuss Youth Day and issues like that is as good of a change as it can be because it's in your sphere of influence. Because not everything will be in your sphere of influence and not everyone will be receptive to your influence. And so being very intentional about where you influence and how you influence is probably the best way to get and have an influence in such a big changing world.
So recently, I was at the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund and they were talking about Youth Day and having more of the youth involved in legislative processes that create policies for children. Would you say people attending more of these funds and just groups and associations is important for upholding what Youth Day means?
I mean, maybe, but not really, right? Because the real issue is that because they're trying to get more people, young people involved in politics through those things, right? Absolutely. But it doesn't do that if you don't change the systems because the political system rewards having people that are past the age of retirement in parliament, right? People that are past the age of retirement making laws. Yeah. So it's like, oh, okay, that's a bit strange if you want youth to get involved, but the system itself doesn't necessarily allow for that. So it's just buying phase if I were to analyze it from my perspective. You know, it's not necessarily speaking to making huge systemic change and stuff like that.
Absolutely. And on the reason why we commemorate things like Youth Day, have you heard any stories from relatives that made it a lot more, let me say, important to you?
Yeah, but not necessarily for Youth Day itself, right? So not necessarily for what happened on the events, but more so the system of apartheid and what it meant for Black people. My gran used to host something called, I forgot what she called it, but it was like an after-school extracurricular type of place where kids would go and do drama, would go and do anything within the arts, right? And she would essentially curate that and give them a space to perform. And they would get raided often because some of those kids were politically active. So there would always be like a child at the corner because my grand's house is like at the corner of the road. So there'd be a child at the corner, and then when they saw those big cars that they called hippos, that guy would scream hippo, and then everyone would just jump and flee. And seeing how close the struggle was to home and the proximity made me think about the system of apartheid differently.
That's really interesting, Kat, on how like apartheid influences the way we view Youth Day. It's very important. Now, on Youth Day being a day of importance, would you say the way we view it now places a lot of pressure on children because there are a lot of assumptions made about us? Oh, we're the future of a country. We're meant to inspire change. Would you say that influences it as well?
I think to some extent, right? Like putting pressure on children to change the world because you broke it is pretty messed up in my world, right? In my view. But I think that it's also what it's come to. So it's the reality of the situation that no one else is going to change the systems that we're part of except us. And like I said, that change can be very small. It can be in your own environment, within your own ecosystem. It doesn't have to be becoming a politician necessarily. So yeah, I think it does put pressure, but regardless of whether it puts pressure, it is something that needs to happen, right? Like the youth do need to start getting involved and changing what they can when they can.
And what effects would you say it has on younger children, not just being oblivious to things that happen in their daily lives on the news? What effect do you think it has on them?
The pressure?
Or just not being aware of things that happen on the news within their own country?
I think it's very, important that we let kids be kids, bro. Like, I think making like an 8-year-old worry about what happened to black people centuries ago is a bit much, right? I think they can be aware of their history, but they ought not carry the kind of generational trauma that is kind of being passed down at the moment. Because even the generation just after the cusp of apartheid, so like 1990 to maybe 2000, are carrying trauma that they don't necessarily understand, and that's not necessarily theirs. And that influences and impacts their ability to make change, right? So you are probably going to see more legacy voters if we are teaching the kids the same thing that were taught to the adults. So it's important that history is acknowledged, but it's also important that children are able to create their own worldview based off what's happening in society right now.
Absolutely. Now, as a kid or as a high school goer, what's one thing you remember the school doing for you that made you realize, oh, the burden I'm going to have to carry on the outside world isn't going to be as large as it is?
To be honest, it was just giving me the platform, right? Letting me push certain things, letting me push boundaries, letting me speak to people, and also giving me access post like school to run something like this and curate something like this. Has been like, oh, this is a burden reliever for me, knowing I'm part of this community. But also meeting the people that I met was a huge burden reliever, right? Knowing that like the school placed me in a position to meet people that are going to change the world, right? Like even some old friends of mine and old boys that are like now in uni as well are super cool people and are pushing super cool things, right? Like people that are still in school right now. I know you're campaigning for JJC and the mayor. That's super dope, right? We have our first black boy that you guys have had in years, right? And he's also pushing crazy things, making big changes. And that was important to me because sometimes it's important to know that you are meeting people that are going to change the world in a way that makes it easier for you. And that also makes the burden easier for yourself, right? You don't necessarily have to be the person who removes the burden, but at least you know that the school breeds people that are world changers and make other people's lives easier. So yeah.
Absolutely. And would you say the fact that Youth Day is something very highly regarded is helping us shift people from wanting to be one particular thing? You know, I want to go to school to become an accountant or an engineer. They're more expansive and they're able to just go for their passions and dreams. Do you think that Youth Day being important helps that?
Yeah, I think to some extent, right? But again, I think it's important that we acknowledge Youth Day, we celebrate and we commemorate the people's lives, but we also use it as a moment to encourage the new generation to choose differently, right? And to never let anyone necessarily box them in, never let anyone push them in a certain direction. So I think you're 100% correct. I think Youth Day gives us an opportunity to do that.
Absolutely. And when we see Youth Day advertised or the things surrounding Youth Day advertised on news, on media, it's generally about children doing creative things like arts and drawings at different functions. Do you think there are other things that should be portrayed about Youth Day that you haven't seen being portrayed?
I suppose so, right? I think the core of Youth Day is, and perhaps I need to brush up on my history, but it's based off of language, right? Which is really at the center of it all. The fact that like the kids were being forced to take all their classes, so physics and Afrikaans. Like if I had to learn physics and Afrikaans, I'd cry because I was already doing physics in English and it was bad, you know? So that the way you comprehend and your intelligence being measured by a completely foreign tool is crazy, you know? And I think that's also something that we need to interrogate and we need to speak to instead of just necessarily putting on a play about what happened on Youth Day, speaking about the power of language, speaking about how we can change how languages are being taught in schools, how languages are being represented, even if it's not a language of instruction, but seeing signage, seeing something that speaks to you in your language is also important and can be directly drawn from Youth Day.
Absolutely. So given that it's Men's Mental Health Month as well, would you say that the burden that's placed on young men or boy children is something that should be acknowledged on Youth Day and isn't really acknowledged as much as it should be currently?
Yeah, I think men have a very hard time, like anyone else in today's society, right? But I think that the like it's becoming much more difficult to take on what is viewed as the traditional role of a man, like a financial provider, like a hard laborer, wah. But I think that gives us an opportunity to reframe what we view as masculinity, what we view as being a man, etc., etc. So I do think that it is an opportunity for us to discuss the burden on men and everything they go through. So yeah, definitely.
When you think about Youth Day, what's one thing that comes to mind that you wish you had known from a young age, that you shouldn't see it as something that's just a holiday, a day where you just get to stay home? What's one thing you wish you knew then?
I suppose I wish I knew, like I said at the top of the interview, the people behind the story, right? We know like the main individual, Hector Peterson, but in terms of how it connects to the entire system, in terms of what it meant for apartheid, and how important it was for tipping the scales. I think that's what I wish I would have known earlier. Knowing how one action can create a cascade, and how it's the most important thing is just to start, bro. Like, it doesn't matter. You don't need to necessarily know where you're going. You don't need to necessarily know the full destination and the full journey, but you just need to get going. Like, you just need to do something. Yeah.
And would you say this day would change the way we view teenagers as well? Because there are a lot of negative associations about adolescence, it being where you struggle the most, where your consciousness is not always clear, so you can't make the correct decisions. Would you say this day can also help us view adolescence as something more of a transitional period?
Yeah, I think so. I think it can definitely. We should give, because teenagers are getting more power in the world. Like, I think your phone is probably the most powerful thing. Like, there's people that are in math classes trading forex, making crazy amounts of money, right?
Yeah.
And that type of power needs to be acknowledged because it's in the hands of teens now. And we need to figure out a way to augment our world such that we can tailor the types of resources we provide to teenagers, right? Like, instead of trying to disempower them, look at how we can get those tools being used for good. Because a child that can use ChatGPT for an essay is actually a very smart child that just needs to channel it differently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I hear what you're saying. So in your matric year at the school, how would you say that Youth Day influenced the rest of the year for you? Did it mean anything to you?
I'll be honest, I don't remember that Youth Day, bro. I don't remember that Youth Day. But I think the year, like the youth days before that, were important in framing how I wanted to approach that year.
Yeah.
Because if you remember correctly, like Hector Peterson, I don't know if he wasn't the first person to be gunned down that day, but I'm pretty sure he was the youngest person, right?
Yeah.
And so the thing that I'm just getting to is that sometimes, you won't necessarily be the first person, and you won't necessarily be, you won't get exactly what you want, but that shouldn't change your motive for pushing. That shouldn't change your motive for vying for change, right? Because I did want to be head of school, but I didn't get head of school.
Yeah.
But the practical implementations of things were more important than the position to implement them from. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. So I remember when you were the deputy head of my school, I think there were a lot of things that you brought into motion, like the Lady Festival. That was something that meant a lot to me. And do you think those are the kinds of things we should have more of the youth striving for, in terms of just having spaces where they can just express themselves and the things that they're interested in, expressing their culture? Do you think we need more spaces like that?
I think 100%, right? And like, even on that, it wasn't necessarily a me thing. It was a collaboration between many people, many of which are still carrying everything on today.
Yeah.
So it's just about collaborating for me. And it's not. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you must always invest in expressing yourself through your culture, whatever the case is. But make sure that those avenues exist for other people if they want to do that. But secondly, just do you. Like, just make sure you're expressing yourself in whatever way makes you feel most yourself.
So there are a plethora of things the youth today is interested in, like on the media. We have a lot of influencers coming about. What's one thing you can say to these people that would help them use their platforms for the correct reasons and not portray a negative image of like the youth being on the media?
So the first thing is that you need not engage in those types of things with the outcome of being an influencer. Like if you listen to most influencers who are great, they were just making silly videos or they were just doing funny things and then they grew a platform, right? So their purpose was driven by their own need for expression and the fame was kind of a secondary thing that wasn't necessarily in their control. So don't go on TikTok wanting to be famous. But if the fame comes because you're on TikTok, great. But the second thing is, once you are in a position of kind of power and influence, remember that brands aren't necessarily only logos or companies. People are brands too. And you need to position yourself as a brand and treat your social image as a brand as well. So you can't just be messy and unnecessarily controversial on social media because now you're influencing other people younger than you. You're influencing other people in general. So you need to make sure that you using your power for good. Otherwise, you're probably just as bad as like a politician.
Yeah. I do get what you're saying. Like, and we do need more of young people being conscious of the things they're doing. Would you say them making a lot of assumptions about the things that they're engaged with, like music creators, artists, is influencing the things that they post and the things that they say?
What do you mean?
Would you say that influences the things they say? The fact that they're engaged with these artists and they gain a lot of what they say from them?
Yeah, I think, they do, because obviously it's pop culture, right? And pop culture has a trickle-down effect. But it's just make sure that it doesn't become you, because it's not you. It's someone else's words, and it's someone else's, like, drip, someone else's swag. So don't steal it, because it won't look as good on you, right?
Yeah.
But if you rock your drip, it will look fire because it's yours, and it's suited for you, suited for your vibe, suited for your energies. They get influenced by other people, but it's important to always remain authentic, remain you.
Yeah. And would you say a lot of people or young people being on the media and trying to portray something that isn't them influences what we think about the youth in general, thinking that they shouldn't, most of them aren't comfortable or confident in who they are? Do you think that plays a large role in it?
Yeah, I think to some extent, like anyone can feel pressure to be someone that they want to be if they're not that person yet. So if I see my boy driving a Lambo with the same age, I want to drive a Lambo, I'm going to feel the pressure to be in that Lambo and to drive a Lambo. So it's obvious, it makes sense for people to feel pressured by especially their peers who are doing better than them if they want to see themselves in those positions. But just run your own race, man.
Absolutely, I do hear what you're saying. Speaking of races, though, what's one thing from, say, a friend or someone much younger than you that you see you'd find interesting that just says, oh, this person's going in a different direction. I wonder how it's going to go. Because I think a lot of young people today are channeled into this one, industry that says, oh, the end result is just getting more money. And it's not a necessarily true image of what that's going to look like. Is there anyone that you think is taking a different approach to the things they want to see in themselves?
I think a example that is perhaps more accessible and most accessible to most people is your current head of school. He's probably one of the most likable people I've ever met, right? He's respectful to everyone. He greets everyone. He's just a kind person, good soul. He has like a very charismatic personality, like the type of personality you'd see on TV or in the creative industry, the industry we're in, right? And he does a lot of things that I'm sure you guys are more privy to than I am, that speak to pushing the envelope, that speak to trying to disrupt slightly, those kinds of things. But he wants to be like an accountant, right? Which is very polar because you think accountants are like very
Yeah.
serious. They don't smile. Boring people. So yeah, I think he's a good example of that, and that's okay too, right? Like that works for him, and happy for him.
I do hear you. So far to being someone who's very outgoing, but still pursuing a relatively serious or a job that has a lot of different ideas about it. Do you think what do you think could attribute to that? Why do you think it is that someone could want to pursue something that isn't necessarily in line with the kind of person they are or how outgoing they are?
It's what I've been saying, right? Like knowing yourself. Just because you fit a mold doesn't mean you need to be that mold. And he knows that he is this type of person, and that means he should follow this type of route. But he knows himself better to say that that is a societal mold. My personality and what I want to do as a career is different, or I can reframe how accountants are viewed. You know what I mean? So it's just saying that people expect me to not do this, so let me go do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've done a lot of podcasts and interviews, and people have asked you a lot about your journey into becoming the person you are today. What would you say is something you think you unconsciously were trying to change about how people who are particularly young are viewed in like very serious environments? What's one thing you think helped you kind of change that image and view people have?
Firstly, I think it's making sure that I always prioritize articulating myself well. And I also like just exist in the way that I want to exist, right? So if I'm on a call with someone or a potential client, I'll probably be in bed, bro. Like,
Yeah.
and that's weird because why are you in bed, bro?
Yeah.
If I was doing like debating competitions online, I'd do those from my blankets with the laptop, like just here, and then I'd be fully covered.
Yeah.
Because there's certain things that are overemphasized. Like, why do I need to dress in like a formal pants for me to sound smarter? Because I can articulate myself the same. You know what I mean? So I think it's just for me, again, not conforming to what people expect, and just always doing me.
Thank you. That really is an interesting thing to say. Just not conforming to a certain ideal that's just taken in about children and trying to change that. But if there was one thing you could leave us with today, what's that one thing?
I think I've said it quite a lot now. Just be
Yeah.
you, bro. Like, just be you and start. Like, just don't be afraid. Start right now, not tomorrow, today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, you heard it here first. That was the INANDA podcast. And with me today was Katlego Mokgosi. I'll see you next time